Hi everyone, our next panel is starting in 3 minutes, so we would appreciate it if you could start getting back to your seats. Thank you. Hi, everyone. The next panel is going to begin in a minute. Please start taking your seats now. Thank you.
Cut them off, or?
I cut people off here and there.
Okay, just cut them off.
Yeah.
Come. Hi, everyone. Everyone? We're just about to start the second session, so if everyone can take your seats again. Thanks.
Hey, everyone. Would appreciate it if you could start settling down. Our next panel is about to begin.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Matoy. I'm a second-year graduate student here at the Kennedy School, and it is my great pleasure to welcome another esteemed set of guests to our second panel today. What I'll do, just like the first panel, is I'll invite each of our guests up, as well as the moderator, by their name, and when I call your name, if you could come up, that would be wonderful. Okay, so first, Sin-Lu Tan is our moderator for today. Sin-Lu is a Master in Public Policy candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is the co-chair of the Southeast Asia Caucus and Diplomacy Chair of W3D. Her passion lies in the nexus of trade, security, and foreign policy, especially in Southeast Asia. She was a Shangri-La Dialogue Fellow at IISS this past summer, and will work in the Singapore government after graduation. Our first panelist that we'll be introducing today is Valerie Chua. Valerie has been instrumental in advancing Singapore's global economic engagement, serving as Regional Vice President for the Americas at the Singapore Economic Development Board since 2022. Previously, she led the EDB's San Francisco office, where she played a critical role in attracting investment and strengthening economic partnerships between Singapore and North America. Our second panelist that we'd like to introduce today is Ted Osius. Ted has been an influential leader in US-Asia relations for over 2 decades. He served as US ambassador to Vietnam from 2014 to 2017, playing a pivotal role strengthening diplomatic and economic ties between the two nations. From 2019 to 2021, he was Vice President for Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google Asia Pacific. Since 2021, he has been President of the US-ASEAN Business Council, where he continues to foster trade, investment, and cooperation between the US and Southeast Asia. The final panelist that I'll be introducing today is Han-koo. Han-koo has been at the forefront of South Korea's global trade and economic policy. He served as Minister for Trade following his duty as Deputy Minister for Trade Negotiations. And then from 2018 to 2019, he was Secretary to the President for New Southern and Northern Policy, leading South Korea's engagement strategies with key regional partners. His expertise spans multilateral trade, digital economy, and strategic regional partnerships. So Han-koo, if I could welcome you up to stage as well. Thank you so much for being here. Well, I think that's about it. This is the Navigating Economic Currents, Trade, Finance, and Geopolitics in the Asia-Pacific panel, and it's a great pleasure to have such a great group of people with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Matoy. I think this panel is happening at a time of incredible relevance. I think for many of us in trade policy, the past 1.5 months is probably more like 1 year. So many things happening. So I think I want to unpack a little bit about what is happening right now with the Trump administration. So we saw President Trump announcing tariffs on both countries and products like Canada, Mexico, China, but also on steel, aluminum. He has also used matters of national emergency like fentanyl to justify some of his trade tariff policy. So Han-koo, I would like to turn to you first. As the former trade minister of South Korea, you were working as a trade minister during Trump 1.0, and you were dealing very closely with his team. So Trump says and does a lot on trade, but not all of it will stick. So I think here what we want to know is what do you think we should be prioritizing and what will stick? What will become the new normal?
Is it too loud? Is it okay? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for having me. I think this is really great to be here. You mentioned that I've gone through this Trump 1.0, not as a trade minister, but actually commercial attaché in Washington, D.C. And all these kind of, strange deja vu is coming back, these days, but in a very, very different, way. Let me explain. I think, Trump 2.0 is very, very different from 1.0, especially, I think, in 3 aspects, speed, magnitude, and purpose. I think the speed, we all, realize that how fast Trump 2.0 is moving, at a lightning speed. You may remember, 8 years ago, actually it was mid-May when this USTR, at that time, Robert Lighthizer, was confirmed in the Senate. So in fact, Trump 1.0 sort of went up to a kind of slow start. But now this is completely different. They are completely set up and then just, hitting the ground, from day one. And then second, magnitude. You may remember that during Trump 1.0, the tariff was actually narrowly, kind of focused on first the steel, Section 232 on steel, and then the washing machine. But now, I think if you just literally calculate all these tariff measures that President Trump is kind of talking about is at least 10 times higher, than that of the first Trump administration. And third, I think purpose, Sin-Lu, you mentioned that, Trump 1.0, actually the tariff was used for economic purposes, but not what we are witnessing is for non-economic purposes. Fentanyl, illegal migration, Panama Canal, Greenland, etc. So I think this Trump 2.0 seems to be using this tariff not just from this conventional point of view, but in a very aggressive and in an aggressive way to achieve this non-economic purpose. And in addition to that, now more and more looks like this Trump 2.0 seems to singing tariff as a way to raise new revenues. This didn't happen in 8 years ago, but with all this tax cut extension coming up by late this year, looks like more and more the tariff are being used as a way to raise the revenue. That's why I think this across the board, maybe 10 or 20% tariff that President Trump has been talking about, reciprocal tariff, and then this when the steel tariff was announced few weeks ago, in principle they announced that there is no exemption or exclusion. Although I believe that there will be, realistically speaking, in the industrial reality, there might be some exclusion, exemption, but at least up front, they try to use this as a really, kind of a structurally changing the industrial, kind of competitiveness of the United States, as well as kind of raising revenue. So going back to your question about what is the new normal, I think this is a really big question, but I think the new normal will be, it's very difficult to imagine to go back to this, post-World War II, Bretton Woods, Washington Consensus, this neoliberal, the economic order. I think we have to really take into consideration all these big kind of moving forces. I think one of which is US-China, this geopolitical rivalry, and then also sort of securitization of the economy. And all these domestic political motivation to bring back jobs and manufacturing. Because during the pandemic, we realized that this outsourcing, all this outsourcing, offshoring, and then just completely depending on foreign companies, foreign countries, especially sort of foreign adversary for many of your kind of supplies, that could be really vulnerable. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Han-koo. I think fascinating analysis on the speed, magnitude, and purpose of these new trade policy. I'll turn to you now, Ted. I think it's also an interesting time, like Han-koo said, of forming up the new normal. I think a lot of things are still up in the air. I don't think Trump has formulated a comprehensive Asia trade policy apart from China. So I think in this moment, and I know in the US-ASEAN Business Council, you do a lot with not just companies, but also Southeast Asia governments and US government. What do you think is the opportunity for both companies in Southeast Asia or the broader region to persuade and influence in a Trump administration? Or what are the levers that these actors can tap on?
Thank you, Sin-Lu. First, thanks for inviting me and to the other organizers. Many years ago, I directed the first play ever to be held in this forum. This was the stage, but a lot of the action took place up there. We had a Greek chorus, all kinds of things. And my husband got an MPP here a few years later, so it's nice to be back. I want to add something to what the minister said. I agree 100% about the significance of using tariffs for non-economic purposes, whether it's fentanyl or deporting people to Colombia or whatever it is, using tariffs as a lever. But there's one other thing that's going on that I think we need to recognize, and it's almost every line of the new administration's trade policy echoes this. It's a domestic narrative that says the United States has been cheated on via the international rules of trade, that we are victims of the international rules of trade. And whether you agree with that or not, it's a compelling political narrative. It certainly helped Trump get elected. So recognizing it for what it is, I think, is super important. So I'm going to answer about what can ASEAN countries do and what companies might be able to do. This little ASEAN flag here has in the middle of it a symbol of 10 rice stalks, and they're bound together, the idea being the rice stalks are much stronger when there are 10 of them together. And I think that's true. 700 million people in ASEAN, fourth largest economy, as Pakita, soon to be fourth largest economy, as Pakita said. And ASEAN in recent years, instead of being just a passive recipient of the rules of trade, is now developing, creating a lot of the rules of trade. And Singapore has been at the center of this. Singapore has a number of digital trade agreements, digital trade frameworks that are setting the rules for subsets. And then Singapore, along with other ASEAN countries, has been negotiating a digital economic framework agreement that will involve probably more than half of the ASEAN countries. Eventually, I hope, expand to all the ASEAN countries and beyond. And so ASEAN is now setting the rules of trade a lot more. So ASEAN has more leverage, perhaps, than it thinks. It's also, along with India, the fastest growing part of the world. Our companies, and I represent more than 100 companies collectively worth $12 trillion, I think have something to say as well. And they've been investing in ASEAN, doing business in ASEAN for a long time. I think the voices of business leaders will be heard in this discussion over tariffs and over other trade measures. And I think that's probably a very good way to influence thinking in the administration, is make sure that a business has its say. We try to do that within ASEAN, where we make sure that when DEFA is being negotiated or other issues are being discussed, that the voices of US business and other businesses are heard. I think that also needs to happen in the United States.
Thank you, Ted. I think that's a very interesting perspective as to how both companies and also Southeast Asia governments can do. So I think, Valerie, from Singapore, you work a lot on the ground to bring US investments back to Singapore. US is Singapore's largest FDI investor, is actually also Southeast Asia region's largest FDI investors. So how are investors thinking about in this new administration with all the uncertainties? And also, what are some of the growth opportunities in the region that investors can still look forward to despite the Trump administration?
Thanks, Sindhu, and obviously thank you to the Harvard Kennedy School for having all of us here. Really, pleasure to be on the panel with Ted and Han-koo as well. So I think the earlier panel also touched a little bit on how a lot of the dynamics are shifting, and I think we're seeing that not just across climate, politically, but certainly across trade and the like. And I think you talked a little bit about the new normal. The truth is that where we are today also looks very different from where we were maybe, let's say, like 10 or even 20 years ago. Today, trade is so integrated. Supply chains are, take your iPhone, for example, right? I think this is a stat from 2021. Just one iPhone was made from components across 43 countries, right? So it's no longer so straightforward where you say, oh, I'm putting in place one trade measure and you have a clearer view on how that's actually going to impact the rest of the supply chain. What's happening is, it's one thing you throw a little rock into the pool, right? And then that ripple effect is really going out across all of the supply chain, right? And this can be, it can be positive effects, it can be negative effects as well. It's not just about tariffs. I think we talked about CBAM previously. That's also a good example where one thing you do actually affects the rest of the supply chain, right? So there, perhaps in a positive direction where you're saying, from a demand perspective, the European economy is saying we want to make sure that products are green. But the effect is actually felt very much from suppliers actually in Asia, right? So they respond to some of these as well. So likewise, if you start looking at things like tariffs or other changes that are made, whether unilaterally or at whatever platforms that you hope certain trade agreements move forward and they don't or whatnot, that actually the ripple effect is really truly felt across a lot of the economy, and not just for businesses but also for consumers like ourselves, right? So you're talking about so supply chain certainly one. I think what you see is actually a lot of companies start thinking about supply chain resilience. It's no longer so straightforward. We are like, low cost location, right? How do you actually factor in all these other considerations as well? So certainly, I think it's quite a common phenomenon. Ted and I were discussing this just now as well, that you do see companies thinking about, okay, what's my supply chain strategy? Do I need to diversify away from certain locations like China, for example, where a lot of companies have very sizable manufacturing footprint there? Do they need to start looking at other locations to actually provide that level of resiliency? I think COVID also highlighted a lot of gaps in the supply chain there. So that's one big change I think that we're seeing. The second is really around business costs. I think the honest truth is that global trade I think was good, at least on a holistic perspective. Maybe certain individual actors perhaps didn't benefit as much from it, but on the whole, the world economy did. And today, if we are introducing more trade frictions, there's a lot more uncertainty. I think the reality is things are just going to cost more, right? As I mentioned, you're not going to optimize always for the lowest cost. You start factoring, geopolitical risk, supply chain risk, and all this comes in. And this actually translates to very real cost differences on the ground. Companies are going to have to make that cost-benefit analysis, and it looks a little bit different, right? It's not just purely commercial. How do they factor some of these in as well? The last part, I think, is around uncertainty. So, you always hope that, you say, companies are going to invest, some of these changes are going to definitely move them in a particular direction. I think what we're actually seeing is that, one, because it's not clear what the final, rulings, for example, will be, that a lot of companies have drawer plans, but nobody has quite sort of pulled the trigger yet, right? And there's also questions on how long are these going to last? Is there going to be sudden switch, for example? I think that we've seen in the past weeks, for example. How do companies react, right? Very often these investments are, they're sizable. If you're building a manufacturing plant, it's hundreds of millions, $1 billion, right? And you want this plant to run for the next 20 years, 30 years. How do you factor in some of these more immediate, perhaps shorter-term changes into actually some of these investment considerations? And are we going to see a scenario where consumers are holding back because they are not sure, right? Businesses are holding back because they're not sure too. And how does that actually affect, frankly, the whole global economy? And on Singapore's end, I think we also see that that's probably going to affect our growth too, right? And as much as we can try, we are also open economy and we are part of that global ecosystem. And I think not just Singapore, but I'm sure a lot of economies in Southeast Asia and globally will see some of that impact as well.
Thanks, Valerie, for that comprehensive overview. So I think it's interesting you talk about supply chain resilience, which brings me very nicely to the next point. So I think US-China has been top of mind for many people here in the Asia-Pacific. Many countries think about how to avoid being caught in the middle of that tension. At the same time, I think in trade particularly, a lot of people also see opportunities there within this US-China competition. There is a China plus one policy that most companies are now adopting, offshoring, friendshoring, reshoring, whatever we're going to call it, to countries nearby. So, but at the same, in view of all this, Trump, though, is also upping its ante on China, the China question, trying to decouple, try to pressure other countries into thinking more about moving away from Chinese supply chains. So my question to all three panelists here is, how long do you think this China plus one policy will hold up? What is the direction you think South Korea, Southeast Asia would have to take to make use of this opportunity they actually see here?
Okay, I'll go first. I think, this US-China competition, I think, ironically, provide opportunities to Southeast Asian countries, and I think to a less extent to Korea and Japan. I think actually this China plus one strategy, that is really actually happening on the ground. And, because I think especially if you look at this high-tech, the segment, semiconductor, EV batteries, in which clearly there's an intersection between economy and security. I think in this sector, we have to be prepared for some sort of decoupling, along the way. But I think there are many other industrial sectors where there's not really much, the security aspect. For example, many of these consumer products, I think, some of these domestic, cultural products, etc. And I think in that, the industrial sector, I think, there could be continuing, cooperation between China and, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asian, countries. So I think that the role of government is important in this sector because not all the countries seize these opportunities arising from this unexpected, in unexpected way from this U.S.-China tension. So if you look at some of these countries in Southeast Asian, country, for example, I think Singapore or Malaysia, I think they are very smart in really trying to provide actual rule of law, but also infrastructure, which is needed, and sort of a one-stop, support system to incoming, foreign investors. So I think those countries are really kind of seize the moment and capitalize on these arising opportunities in the midst of this all the uncertainty, etc. So yes, this is challenges to all of us, but also if you look at more closely, also there are opportunities arising. And then I think it depends on how you do and what you do to really capture those opportunities.
So first, I agree with what the minister said. The opportunities have been appearing actually for some years because companies have been adopting China plus one or China plus three strategies for quite a few years. Vietnam has been one of the key beneficiaries within ASEAN of this decision to diversify. And it's business-driven. These are business-driven decisions to diversify, for businesses to lower their exposure in China. But I wanted to come to something that President Elbegdor said about the reliability of China as a neighbor. And Pak Gita kind of echoed it when he talked about the numbers, the balances that exist in sort of trade with China versus trade with the United States. But the president said, when I would go to China, I felt there was a win-win possibility, that I was dealing with a fairly reliable partner. Well, this is a challenge that the United States has to face because we right now, because of one of the things the minister mentioned, especially in the area of tech, we aren't necessarily seen as the most reliable partner. That's a challenge. And then back to this issue of the countries of Southeast Asia having agency. The Southeast Asian countries are part of RCEP. They're part that you negotiated. They're part of CPTPP. They're part of a web of trade arrangements. They're boosting their ties with the EU, with Canada. Just last year, Vietnam signed a comprehensive economic partnership with the UAE. ASEAN upgraded its ASEAN-China Free Trade Area. Philippines completed an FTA with South Korea. Indonesia with the Gulf Cooperation Council. Thailand with the EFTA countries, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. They're not waiting. These countries are not waiting for the United States to change its views on trade. They're going ahead. And even though the United States absorbs a third of the world's imports, the rest of the world absorbs 2/3. So there are directions that the ASEAN countries can take that lead them away from the United States. I think we need to be aware of that and be very clear about it, that we have options now that we won't necessarily have in the future to pursue American prosperity and strengthen American ties with that really critical part of the world.
I really like what you said, Ted. I think it's also why the Asia Pacific Conference is so important, because everyone talks about US, everyone talks about China, everyone talks about US-China. No one usually look at what middle powers, smaller powers can actually do when they band together, as well as what optionalities they can explore. And Valerie, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on the previous question.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in a little bit in this time of, I guess, of uncertainty. It kind of reminds me a little bit of how everyone is rushing towards gold. If you've seen sort of the price of gold, that's obviously been going up every time tariffs are announced. It's, it pops, and then kind of moves somewhat in sync. And I think what we see is sort of that flight to certainty, if you will. And in some ways, I would say Singapore is somewhat uniquely positioned. And I think Pak Gita mentioned this as well, that in some ways, I think what we see is that companies or certainly investors view us as that, that little island, that bastion of stability, if you will, in sort of the seas of uncertainty that are out there. And I think we certainly play part of that role, and together with a lot of our ASEAN partners. I think Han-koo mentioned a little bit around, whether it's joint infrastructure, whether it's partnerships. There are many ways in which it's not just sort of Singapore being that hub and that landing location, but how do we actually partner with a lot of our neighboring countries? I mean, we're small, right? We don't have all that resources, and a lot of our partners do. So how do we work together with them? So a great example is the Singapore-Johor Special Economic Zone, where we signed the agreement earlier this year. And the Special Economic Zone is actually 4 times the size of Singapore. Right? So you just imagine the possibilities there, and the ability to also, frankly, tap onto talent that's available in Malaysia. Some of that is happening today, but how do we smoothen that process, right? So the border crossing actually between Johor and Singapore is one of the busiest international land border crossings. So 350,000 people every day move back and forth between that border crossing. And so the ties are there. We are tapping onto sort of that talent, that broader resource base. But how do we together as ASEAN, together as partners, actually go out there and make ourselves continue to be attractive, continue to be a location that actually helps to serve the broader global economy, right? Whether it's for US companies or companies from anywhere else that are looking to grow. But that certainly is an opportunity, I think, that we continue to see. The other part to highlight as well is that actually Asia itself is a really interesting market, right? I think Ted mentioned 700 million people in Southeast Asia, right? That's a huge number. It's like double the size of the US, right? It's going to be the 4th largest economy by 2030. It's a great demographics. 60% of the population in Southeast Asia is under the age of 35. So if you're thinking about your future workforce, your future consumers, these are the people you go after, right? And what we continue to see is that, maybe there's a little bit of question about should companies set up, perhaps the question, or rather from U.S. companies' perspective, do I set up global operations in some part of Asia that maybe has linkages to supporting the U.S., or do I set something up that targets specifically the Asia market? I think the latter is very clear that the opportunity and being close to the market, that is something that works, and that companies will continue to pursue, right? So whether it is looking at consumer products that are targeted to the market there, right? How do you be close to the market? How do you understand the market? Even if you do data science, for example, right? Do you do that from here, or do you do that where you're closer to the market and you understand the consumers, right? You look at companies like Google, their next billion users business unit is actually in Singapore, to create new solutions that target, whether it's the global south, whether it's Southeast Asia, the rest of Asia certainly, Do you do that from Silicon Valley? You could, but you're actually one step removed from where the market is. And I think that fundamental sort of opportunity remains. And whatever is happening out there, companies are still interested in that. That's still the economic opportunity and the commercial opportunity.
Thank you, Valerie. I think it's a very good point on how countries in Southeast Asia and Asia is not just individual countries themselves, but a market, regional market and beyond. I think this is a good point. So before I ask my next question, if you have any more questions, if you have any questions, feel free to line up behind the mics. They are both on the left and right on this side and on the upper level. So I have one more question and I'll open it to the floor. So I think it's a good time to also talk about the role of multilateral plurilateralism in trade. So with Trump as a very transactional president, there's a lot of talk about deal making as well. Where do you see the role of regional or multilateral organizations or FTAs in building the trade normal moving forward? Yeah, Han-koo, maybe you have some thoughts.
I think this rulemaking. I think some the previous panelists mentioned the ASEAN and or to a, in broader term, this Asia is at the forefront of rulemaking in this trade. I think 100% agree, and I think that Asia needs to play a more active role in this trade rulemaking. For example, the Korea, our export to China account for about 19-20%, and our export to the United States about 18%. So in total, about 38 to 40%, right? And then third, the largest destination for Korea's export is ASEAN. It's bigger than European Union, and then it is about 18% also. And I think it will be continue to grow because of this young population, rising of the middle class, etc. So I think we have to, of course, we have to pay attention to like 40% from Korea's point of view, but there's a 60% of this, the U.S. and China, which we can call it middle power countries or third nation, and realistically speaking, if you look at the landscape, political landscape of United States, and also China's also political dynamics, it will be difficult for us to expect this the two superpower come back to this multilateral trading platform and the play a leadership role in sort of a new rulemaking. So what do? The rest of the the world, do we just wait 4 more years or 8 more years? But as our previous the panelists mentioned, there are really pressing global challenges. The climate change, this rulemaking in this the intersection between trade and climate change, CBAM or carbon pricing, that is also a pressing issue. Supply chain resilience, the current this bilateral or plurilateral trade agreement don't really address this supply chain resilience issue. So there are really, and also a lot of this industrial policy. WTO, have this the rules related to subsidies, but maybe 30 years ago, and so the current the trade rule don't really reflect this fast changing global trade and economic environment. So I argue that Asia has CPTPP and RCEP and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, etc. At least Asia, there's a lot of this kind of very active rulemaking going on right now. So I think this middle power countries, in Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, really it's time to step up our efforts and then to continue to advance this pressing, to address these, pressing global challenges and kind of really make our efforts to make new rules. So I think if that happens, and if the rest of the world are really creative and constructive in developing new rules, I think that could incentivize this U.S. domestic political kind of landscape to change. That we are falling behind the rest of the world. So the United States also need to sort of change and adjust to this rapidly changing this global trading environment.
Thank you, Han-koo. Fascinating view.
So again, I agree with the minister. I think that it's very hard to see the United States getting very excited right now about multilateral agreements. But so let's talk about deal making for a moment. I mean, what can we do? Ambassador Blake mentioned that there is money to be made in the energy transition. We have kind of maybe four big chunks of companies in the council, those that are focused on tech broadly, those that are focused on energy and the energy transition, those that are focused on health and life sciences, and one's focused on financial services. I see possibilities for a deal on rare earths, deals on minerals, deals on the digital economy. Now, a deal tends to be more transactional than a broad-based trade agreement. It's not necessarily going to be as holistic as to include dispute settlement mechanisms and those elements that are usually in a traditional trade agreement. But there's still something to work with in the deal-making realm. And again, I think the nations of Southeast Asia and other middle powers have a fair amount of agency when it comes to looking for what might be possible to make deals. And the United States has a lot to offer on fintech, on the energy transition, on EVs, whatever way it goes, on renewable energy. Just last year, our members announced over $20 billion of investments in digital infrastructure in Southeast Asia, in data centers, undersea cables, cloud hubs. And they did it because there's growth. There's the opportunity is there. The digital economy is expected to reach $1 trillion by 2030, and companies go where there's money to be made. So we still I still think that allows us to move forward, to remain engaged. But if we pull out of IPEF, I don't know if we formally pulled out of IPEF or not, we've sort of removed ourselves from the table when it comes to plurilateral and multilateral deal making. I think that's a loss, but I think we ought to then move where we can move.
That's a good point.
I mean, very much agree with my fellow panelists. Just want to add on to, I guess, one of the points that Ted made that, companies, I think, are continuing to go because there is the economic opportunity. So as an example, US companies just in 2023 made $51 billion of income from their investments and operations in Singapore, right? So that's a non-trivial amount, and companies will continue to pursue that, regardless, I guess, of whatever happens, whether it's multilateral and the like agreements. So I do think that it will be a challenging environment on that front. But certainly, I think so long as there is money to be made, I think the private sector will continue to pursue that path. The question, I guess, is how governments can smooth that path or make that path more challenging.
Can I just add, there are 6,000 US companies that are in Singapore. I used to work for Google. Was our regional headquarters. It's for the reasons that Pakita laid out. Sanctity of contract, reliability when it comes to rule of law. I think there are a lot of opportunities that companies are going to pursue no matter what, and they see Singapore as a good launching point for a lot of their activities, but they see these huge markets around Singapore where they want to do more. They want to be successful. They see a market of 300 million in Indonesia, 100 million in Vietnam, 100 million in the Philippines, and then just over the over on the other side, 1.3 billion in India. So companies are going to remain really active, and that alone, no matter what governments are doing, means that they'll play a leadership role.
Thank you, panelists. I think we have had a really dynamic and engaging discussion. I would like to open now to the floor for questions. Gentlemen on that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you guys so much. This was a really nice panel. I had a really quick question.
So sorry, and if you could introduce yourself before the question.
Oh, sure, yes. My name is Eric. I'm a student at the college. I'm in a dual degree at the Graduate Schools of Arts and Sciences. And I'm really interested in kind of the economics of these kinds of international trade and some of the industries and how some specific industries are actually affected. Now, in the US discourse, a lot of the focus in the past few years has been on tech and AI, but especially in the current environment, people have started to talk a little bit more about the implications of these tariffs on industries like manufacturing and agriculture. I was wondering if you guys could give your opinions on what industries other than tech will start to face in terms of their challenges. What are some unique issues that manufacturing will face, agriculture will face, and whether or not there are some ways that we can foresee these challenges and perhaps help them in the current geopolitical environment.
Thank you, Eric. And in the interest of time, we will take another one from the right.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ryan Delgadio. I'm a third year at the law school. I think it's really easy to talk about challenges and also opportunities when it comes to firms interacting with Asia-Pacific governments. My question is, with this administration, what opportunities do businesses see to work with USG on some of these issues?
Thank you. And then if any panelists would like to start.
Sure, and I'm going to start with Ryan's question. The tech companies, look at who was there for the inauguration, who sat there, Sundar Pichai, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg. These companies definitely see an opening right now, and they feel like the wind is at their back. They feel like they didn't always get the support that they wanted from the previous administration, and they think that the heft of the United States may be used to push in some areas where they think pushing is required. And I think that's reasonable. I think that when governments push for a level playing field, companies do better. And this, I'm still going to focus on the area of tech because that's where so much of the energy is. In the area of tech, which is growing so fast, you have this bifurcation that's underway. You have these disruptions in supply chains because of export controls and other reasons. So that's a big challenge. But some of those challenges are warranted. Techno-nationalism is real. There is a competition to go after the secrets, the trade secrets, or the very expensive R&D that companies have undertaken, and just steal it rather than develop it yourselves. And I think there's going to be a need for strong enforcement, a need for strong export control regimes, a need for protecting supply chains that wasn't as urgent before as it is now.
Thank you. And Valerie, if I could invite you to answer the question on what other sectors apart from tech are there opportunities?
I mean, in terms of opportunities, okay, so tech definitely, I think, a very clear, large one. I think other areas where, I guess Asia has a unique proposition in some ways, certainly I think around consumer, increasingly around actually the area of healthcare. So as healthcare becomes more, I guess, sort of targeted, if you think about precision medicine, for example, what we see actually is a gap, for example, in some of the research that's being done in the US, is around, I suppose, more like minority phenotypes. So you don't get as much sort of like genetic diversity or perhaps representation in this part of the world, but that also means that the drugs that are developed perhaps are better fit for certain phenotypes. And what we see is actually quite a number of healthcare companies, for example, coming to Singapore to see if they can get access to certain data, research that's more focused on Asian phenotypes, so that when they actually develop products, it is more suited and you get better health outcomes. And obviously on Singapore's side, we're happy to work with them as well, because then that actually helps our population health outcomes. So something interesting we're doing, in fact, is actually mapping out the genome of a certain percentage of the population in Singapore. So we're, I think, about 100,000 today. The target is to get to about 500,000 or 1 million. And this is actually information that we partner with select companies on, so that they can actually come and use that as part of the R&D process. And together we co-develop some solutions that actually work very well for the Asia market. And I think in some of the other sectors, certainly I think climate, I want to mention that as well. There's a lot of talk around renewable energy, but I do think we should also look at carbon markets, nature-based solutions. That's something where Asia actually has or Southeast Asia has an overrepresented opportunity. Southeast Asia accounts for about 25% of the global nature-based solutions capacity. And today we're not tapping on that very well because of issues on financing and the like. But if we can actually come in to help to defray or address some of the pre-credit risk, for example, for some of these projects, is that something that we can move? And I think Singapore is playing part of that role in working with some of our regional as well as global partners to address some of those challenges as well. So I do think that there are plenty of opportunities out there.
Thank you, Valerie. I see there's lots of questions for our panelists here. So maybe we'll take all three at one time, both on the ground and then one from up. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Corrine. I'm from Northeastern University.
Sorry, can you speak closer to the mic?
Yes, sorry. My name is Corrine, and thank you for such a good talk. My question is, as China pushes for de-dollarization in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific area through maybe like a yuan-based oil trade or panda bonds and BRICS financial incentives, how should Asia-Pacific economies navigate the emerging multipolar financial landscape? Should nations fully embrace yuan-based trade transactions, maintain a balance between US dollar and yuan, or develop alternative regional currency frameworks to safeguard the economic sovereignty of their countries?
Thank you. And another.
Great. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Abdi, graduate student here at Kennedy School. My question is for Ted. So I want to pick up on the opportunity of offshoring and also China plus one for ASEAN economies. Let's not forget that other than Singapore, all nations in ASEAN are developing countries, so they're competing for these opportunities. And you emphasized that Vietnam has been a primary beneficiary of this opportunity. My question is, from US business perspective, what do you see government of Vietnam and also their private sector has done differently from other developing countries in ASEAN, and how other countries can learn from them? Thank you.
Yep, and gentlemen.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Jason Lee. I'm a first-year master's student here at the Kennedy School. I'm from Malaysia. I would like to double dive into some of the points that you mentioned. First, you mentioned a growing integration between the private and public sector, but also a growing integration between trade policy and foreign policy. Given that, as we see in Asia Pacific, a lot of the countries aggressively pursue strategic independence where they don't like to pick sides. How much is that strategic independence going to be an asset or liability given these trends of integration? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have three questions, one on the de-dollarization, second one on developing country competition, and third one on how strategic autonomy, independence, whether it's a liability or a opportunity. If any of the panelists want.
Yeah, I can take the last question. I think Southeast Asian countries and Northeast Asian countries, by nature, they are very export-oriented. So I think interdependence is inevitable, but over-dependence could be vulnerable. So I think people talk about now it's an uncertain and volatile world, and people talk about kind of a deglobalization, but I disagree. I think it continues to globalize, but in a sort of a different way. So I think WTO kind of named it as a sort of a re-globalization. So I think the solution to this uncertainty and vulnerability should come from diversifying your portfolio. You continue to make interdependence as one of your core pillars, but just kind of preventing this over-dependence in some of the strategic products or technology so that not to put yourself in a kind of vulnerable position.
So on the competition point, and I'm actually asked this question by representatives of other ASEAN countries. Sometimes it's pretty blunt. What is Vietnam doing that we're not doing? And I would kind of break it down into 4 areas. One thing, the Vietnamese leadership has made itself very open to input, especially from the business community. I mean, I'm going next week, bringing 61 companies to Vietnam. We will get a meeting with the Prime Minister. All of his ministers will be there. He will instruct them on the spot to fix problems within 2 or 3 weeks. It's very practical decision making, and I guess it's easier to do that when you're a one-party system. There's a streamlining that's going on in Vietnam. Instead of adding new ministries, as some countries are doing, Vietnam is cutting down the number of ministries and cutting down the decision-making points to make for faster decision-making to respond to the needs of business. They've been very engaged in problem solving. When there's an issue that needs to be fixed, whether it's a regulatory issue or legal issue, we get a hearing. I would say US business gets a hearing. And usually we can get things resolved pretty fast. And then the last point, and I think this is important, the Vietnamese made a big decision a few years ago, which has only been accelerated since, that the only way they get from lower middle income to being a lower middle income country to an upper middle income country is through innovation. That in today's global economy, you have to innovate your way up the value chain, or you're going to be stuck making shoes forever. And they don't want to do that. They want to be not just packaging chips. They want to be designing and doing the R&D behind chips. They want to be leaders in AI and in biotech and in quantum computing. And they have been making strategic decisions about where to put resources so that that innovation can occur. When the General Secretary of the Communist Party, not necessarily the person you'd think would be most likely to do this, when he visited the United States last fall, he went up to Columbia University and he asked Columbia to help him think through, and the party to think through, where were Vietnam's areas of greatest comparative advantage in the tech space. And he said, I want you to do your work faster, your academic work faster, because I want these ideas to be in the documents that the Communist Party considers when it has its 26th Party Congress in January 2026. That means he wants, at the highest level, the decision-making to be about an innovation economy. That opens the door for American companies more than anything else does.
Thank you, Ted. And Valerie, if you have any thoughts on de-dollarization?
I don't think I'm in a position to comment on that.
Thank you. So I think we're at time. Can we join hands together to thank our panelists for this incredible session?
Thank you.
I'm also aware that there are more questions the floor might have. Our panelists are all going to be there for the small group Ask Me Anything at 4 p.m., so if you can catch them then. All right, and I think Kang has an arranged, the gift bags, yes. Asia Center has prepared gift bags as a token of appreciation for our panelists. Thank you. And if we can take a photo together.
Thank you. Absolutely.